The letter from Steubenville, Beverly Hills, California, October 1972. Dean Martin's home office sat in the quiet rear wing of the house, far from the laughter that usually filled his living room, far from the clink of glasses, far from the familiar hum of Hollywood visitors and industry conversations. This was the room where he handled the parts of fame no one ever photographed. Shelves bowed under the weight of scripts he hadn't yet read. Framed gold records reflected the late afternoon sun. Contracts lay stacked neatly beside unopened boxes of promotional material. There were handwritten notes from producers, invitations to galas, neatly typed proposals promising the next big thing. And there were letters, always letters, hundreds of them, some from fans who swore his voice had gotten them through heartbreak, some from strangers asking for money, some from people convinced he was the answer to their problems. Most were predictable. Most were filtered before they ever reached his hands. Margaret Chen had worked for Dean for nearly 8 years. She knew which envelopes to open quickly, which to skim, which to discard, and which very rarely to walk into his office and place directly on his desk. That Tuesday afternoon, she had been moving through the usual pile with mechanical precision when she noticed a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was careful, almost formal, yet uneven, as if each letter had required effort. The postmark made her pause. Steubenville, Ohio. She turned the envelope over once. Then again, something in her chest tightened in a way she couldn't explain. She opened it, intending only to glance. Instead, she read the first line, then the second, then she sat down. A few minutes later, Dean was on the phone discussing a potential television appearance when Margaret appeared in the doorway. She didn't interrupt him. She simply stood there. He noticed immediately. Margaret never hovered. He finished the call more quickly than planned and looked up. "What is it?" She held out the envelope. "This one isn't like the others." He took it, mildly curious. The weight of it surprised him, not physically, emotionally. He saw the postmark, his hometown, a place he rarely spoke about, a place the world never associated with the man on television. He opened the letter. By the end of the first paragraph, he was no longer sitting back in his chair. His name was written there, not as the world knew him, but as almost no one alive still did. Dino. The room seemed to quiet around him as he read the careful words of a woman who had known him before the lights, before the applause, before the tailored suits and sold-out theaters. A woman who had known him when his shoes were thin, when his lunches were empty, when his confidence was something he borrowed rather than owned. A woman who wrote not as a fan, but as someone carrying a memory that had never loosened its grip. She told him who she was. His third-grade teacher. Grant Elementary School. The date alone pulled him backward, not gently but completely. He saw the old brick building before he even finished the page. He could smell the chalk, hear the scrape of desks, feel the cold of Ohio winters through coats that never quite fit right. He remembered sitting near the back, not because he misbehaved, but because he preferred to be less visible, less available for laughter, less available for correction, less available for the kind of looks that reminded him he did not belong to the same world as the other children. He read how she remembered him. Hungry, quiet, often tired, always trying. And then he reached the lines that described a winter afternoon he himself had buried so deeply that it surfaced not as memory, but as sensation. The hallway, the laughter that didn't sound playful, the way cruelty from children carried a special sharpness because it was untrained, unfiltered, and unashamed. The way he had pressed himself against a wall that day, not because it helped, but because he didn't know what else to do with his body. His throat tightened. He could not recall the exact words used. He did not need to. The feeling was enough. The familiar heat in the face. The way pride and humiliation tangled until neither could move. The urge not to cry, not because tears hurt, but because they invited more of what had already begun. He read how she had heard them, how she had intervened, how she had sent them away, and how afterward she had done what no adult had ever done for him in that way before. She had noticed. Not his grades, not his mistakes, him. He read about the sandwiches, about the excuses, about the quiet understanding between a woman who did not want to wound a child's pride and a child who pretended not to know he was being saved. His eyes blurred before he realized tears were forming. Because he did remember that. Not as a series of days, but as relief. As the way his stomach sometimes didn't hurt. As the way school occasionally felt survivable. as the way one person's presence had made a place of fear feel briefly less hostile. Then he reached the lines where she apologized, not for failing him academically, but for not fighting harder, for not demanding more from a world that had accepted children going hungry as normal, for not standing up more fiercely to assumptions made about children whose parents spoke differently, worked harder, and had less, for believing, at the time, that kindness was all she was allowed to offer. And then she wrote something that shook him. She said she had spent decades believing she had failed him. Dean lowered the paper. The office no longer felt like an office. It felt like a room where two lives had quietly collided across nearly half a century. He sat there longer than he realized, staring not at the walls but at a narrow classroom in Ohio, at a small desk, at a boy who had not yet learned how to hide disappointment behind humor, at a teacher who had not known that small acts do not stay small. Margaret had remained nearby, silent. When he finally spoke, his voice surprised both of them. "I need to go home." She blinked. "Home, sir." "Steubenville." He did not say it dramatically. He said it as if the decision had been made somewhere far deeper than thought. "Today." Margaret hesitated. "You have rehearsals, a recording session, 2 meetings." "Cancel them." She studied him carefully. In 8 years she had seen him tired, frustrated, even angry. She had never seen him like this. "She's dying," he said, "and she thinks she failed me." He stood, the letter still in his hand, no longer shaking but no longer light. "And she didn't." He looked around the room that represented everything the world believed success looked like. "I wouldn't be here without her, and she deserves to know that while she can still hear it." Margaret nodded once, then again, already reaching for the phone. As she turned away, Dean added something that made her pause. "Call Robert too." "My lawyers." "Yes." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "I'm not just going to visit her," he said quietly. "I'm going to finish what she started." Outside, the California sun continued to shine on trimmed hedges and polished gates, and the comfortable distance between celebrity and consequence. Inside, a man who had spent a lifetime being watched without being seen folded a letter and placed it carefully into his jacket. Somewhere in Ohio, an old teacher believed she had not done enough. Dean Martin was about to change that. And neither of them yet knew how far the ripple would go. The drive back to who he was. By the time Margaret's calls were finished, the house had taken on a strange, hushed energy, as if even the walls understood that this wasn't one of Dean Martin's usual sudden changes of plan. A flight was booked within the hour, a car arranged on the Ohio side, and Robert Klein, who had long ago learned that Dean's calm voice often carried decisions as final as stone, was already on his way to the airport with a leather briefcase full of papers he didn't yet understand the purpose of. Dean packed without ceremony, the way a man packs when he isn't traveling toward a deal or a premiere but toward something raw, something unresolved. He didn't bring much. A few shirts, a coat, the essentials, and the letter. The letter stayed with him, folded carefully and placed where he could reach it without thinking, as if the paper itself had become a compass. In the car to the airport, Lowe's angels moved past the windows like a familiar film he'd acted in too many times. Palm trees, clean sidewalks, confident billboards, young faces chasing the dream that had long ago stopped feeling like a dream to him. He watched it all with a distance he couldn't fully explain, because for the first time in years he wasn't thinking about what was next. He was thinking about what had been. Every few minutes his fingers drifted toward his jacket pocket, touching the edge of the envelope as if to confirm it was real. And each time he felt it, his mind returned to that boy in Steubenville who had once believed the world was divided into people who mattered and people who didn't, and that his family had been stamped with a permanent mark that placed them on the wrong side of that line. At the private terminal, there were no crowds, no screaming fans, no flashbulbs. That should have felt like relief, but instead it made everything sharper. In silence, his thoughts grew louder. He sat waiting to board and found himself staring at his hands, the same hands that had shaken thousands of hands, signed contracts worth more money than his father would have believed existed, lifted glasses in rooms where the air smelled like expensive cologne and easy laughter. Yet the letter had made those hands feel suddenly unfamiliar, as if they belonged to two different men at once, the famous man the world recognized, and the child who had once pressed his fists to his stomach to quiet hunger so he could focus on the chalkboard. When Robert arrived, slightly out of breath, he looked at Dean with the professional caution of someone who knew better than to ask, "Why now?" but couldn't stop the concern from his eyes. Dean only nodded in greeting, and when Robert began to speak, Dean held up the envelope as if it answered everything. Robert read the postmark, and in that moment his expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. Not full understanding, no one could fully understand another man's past, but enough to realize this wasn't a publicity move or a sentimental whim. This was something deeper, something that would not be negotiated. On the flight, Dean didn't drink. Robert noticed, but said nothing. Dean stared out the window as California fell away beneath them, the coastline folding into distance, and felt as if the plane wasn't merely crossing miles, but crossing years. His mind kept returning to details he hadn't thought about in decades. The smell of his father's work clothes, heavy with steel and sweat. The way his mother's hands looked after long days of laundry work, knuckles reddened by hot water and harsh soap. The sound of Italian spoken softly in their kitchen late at night, when they thought the children were asleep and could not hear fear disguised as conversation. He remembered how quickly children learned shame, how it arrived not as one single moment but as hundreds of tiny moments. A lunchbox with nothing in it, shoes that didn't match, teachers who assumed silence meant stupidity, classmates who laughed when he mispronounced a word. Those memories weren't dramatic, not in the way Hollywood liked drama, but they were heavy because they were true. And now, after all these years, a single woman had reached across time and said, "I saw you, I was there, and I'm sorry." That apology didn't make him weak. It made him feel something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time, the ache of being remembered accurately. They landed in Pittsburgh after dark, the air colder than California, the kind of cold that didn't just touch skin but sank into bones. Dean stepped out and immediately felt it in his chest, an old kind of cold, the kind that carried its own memories. The airport smelled different too, less perfume, more winter coats, and hurried footsteps. The world here didn't move like a red carpet world. It moved like a working world, where people had places to be and bills to pay and families waiting at home. Dean put on his coat and didn't complain. It felt right. As they walked toward the rental car, Robert started to talk about logistics, about whether it was wise to meet the teacher immediately, about how to protect Dean's privacy, about potential press attention if anyone recognized him. Dean listened politely, then stopped walking for a moment and turned to Robert with a calm that carried steel beneath it. "This isn't about privacy," he said. "This isn't about me being seen." He held Robert's gaze. "It's about her being seen." Robert nodded then, and something in his posture softened. Even lawyers understood certain kinds of urgency. The drive from Pittsburgh to Steubenville was quiet at first, the highway stretching through darkness, the car headlights carving narrow tunnels of visibility through the night. Dean watched the landscape change slowly, as if the land itself was reminding him how far he had traveled from this place. There were stretches where the road ran alongside older towns, the silhouettes of factories and smokestacks visible against the sky like black bones. The farther they drove, the more Dean felt the pressure in his chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with something like returning. Returning to the part of himself he had built a career outrunning. He had loved his hometown in the way a child loves what he knows, but he had also left it with the determination of someone who had promised himself he would never be hungry again, never be small again, never be at anyone's mercy again. Now he was coming back not as the kid who had escaped, but as the man who had survived, and the thought made him both proud and strangely tender. As the miles passed, Dean reached into his jacket and unfolded the letter again under the dim overhead light. He didn't need to reread it. He could have recited parts of it from memory already. But he read it anyway, slower this time, as if he wanted to inhabit each sentence and honor the effort it took to write. He studied the shakiness of the handwriting in his mind and imagined Alina Russo at a small table with a lamp, pausing between words when pain flared, continuing anyway because something in her conscience demanded completion. He thought of teachers everywhere, women and men whose names never appeared in headlines, who held the weight of children's struggles quietly, who carried guilt for what they couldn't fix in a world that asked them to fix everything with chalk and patience. He realized then that the letter wasn't just a message. It was a confession, a final attempt to make peace. And he understood something that startled him. This trip wasn't only about giving her comfort. It was also about releasing her from a burden she had never deserved to carry. By the time they crossed into Ohio, the sky had shifted slightly, clouds thinning, moonlight brushing the edges of distant hills. Robert asked softly, "What exactly do you want to do?" Dean didn't answer immediately. He watched the road, then spoke with a steadiness that felt like a decision formed long before the words existed. "I want her to know she didn't fail," he said. "I want her to know that what she did mattered." He paused, then added, "And I want to make sure no kid in that town has to sit in class with an empty stomach the way I did." Robert glanced at him, careful. "That's a large goal." Dean's mouth tightened, not with anger, but with conviction. "So what?" he said. "I've done plenty of large things for applause. This one won't be for applause." He looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. "This one will be because it's right." Steubenville appeared gradually, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a quiet presence. Streetlights, modest homes, older buildings, the faint outline of industry in the distance. Dean's heart began to beat faster, not because the town had changed, but because it hadn't changed enough. The same kind of roads, the same kind of neighborhoods, the same sense of hardworking people holding up a community with tired hands. He wondered how many children were going to bed hungry tonight. He wondered how many teachers were quietly slipping food to students while pretending it was extra. He wondered how many boys like Dino Crocetti were sitting at the back of a classroom, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked nourishment, sleep, and belief. They found Alina's address through a local directory and drove through a neighborhood that looked like 1,000 other American neighborhoods. Small yards, porch lights, curtains drawn, the quiet dignity of people living their lives without a spotlight. When the car stopped in front of a modest house with a garden resting for winter, Dean didn't move immediately. He sat there with one hand still on the letter in his pocket, staring at the front door as if it held more than a person behind it. It held the past. It held the version of himself he had tried to outgrow. Robert cleared his throat softly, giving Dean space rather than prompting him. Finally, Dean exhaled, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold. The night air hit him like a reminder. It wasn't cruel, just honest. The kind of air that didn't care who you were. He walked up the path slowly, hearing the crunch of gravel under his shoes, noticing details the way people notice details when they're nervous. The shape of the mailbox, the worn paint on the railing, the small wind chime near the porch that moved slightly with each breeze. At the door he paused. For a moment he pictured Alina Russo as she must have been in the 1920s, standing in front of a chalkboard, hair pinned back, eyes alert, voice calm and steady. Then he pictured her now, frail in pain, writing a letter to a student who had become a star. The contrast made his chest ache. He knocked. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened, and a woman in her 40s or 50s appeared, her face tired in the way caregivers are tired, not from lack of sleep alone, but from emotional strain. She looked at Dean with polite confusion, then her expression shifted as recognition arrived like a wave. She didn't gasp dramatically, but her eyes widened and her mouth parted in disbelief, as if her mind was scrambling to accept what her senses were telling her. Dean offered a gentle smile, not the entertainer's smile, but something quieter. "My name is Dean Martin," he said softly. "I received a letter from Alina Russo. I'm here to see her." The woman's breath caught. For a second she looked like she might cry or laugh or both. Then she placed a hand against the doorframe as if to steady herself. "I'm Susan," she said, voice trembling, "her daughter." She glanced over her shoulder toward the hallway as if afraid her mother might vanish if she turned away too long. She's very weak," Susan continued. "Some days she doesn't wake up much." Dean nodded, understanding. "If it's not the right time," Susan shook her head quickly, wiping at one eye with the back of her hand as if embarrassed by emotion. "No," she whispered. "No, it's the right time. God, it's the right time." She stepped back. "Please come in, please." Inside, the house was warm, smelling faintly of soup and medicine and the gentle sweetness of old furniture. Dean moved carefully through the hallway, suddenly aware of how loud his shoes sounded on the floor, how his presence might feel like a disruption in a home that had been shaped by sickness and waiting. Susan led them toward the back, and with every step, Dean felt the weight of what he was about to do. Not perform, not impress, not charm, but simply speak truth into a room where regret had lived too long. The bedroom door was open. A hospital bed had been set up near the window. A lamp cast soft light across a woman whose body looked smaller than memory could have predicted, as if illness had quietly taken pieces of her over time. Alina Russo's hair was white, her face lined deeply, her hands thin. Yet when her eyes opened and found Dean, there was a sudden sharpness there, life, intelligence, awareness, like a candle refusing to go out quietly. For a moment, she stared at him, as if her mind couldn't reconcile the man with the boy. Then her lips trembled. Dean stepped forward slowly, like approaching something sacred. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down so he wouldn't stand over her, so he could meet her on the level of humanity, not fame. He took the letter from his pocket and held it gently. "Hello, Miss Russo," he said, and his voice cracked slightly at the end, not from weakness but from the enormous tenderness of saying that name again. Eleanor's eyes filled, and a sound escaped her that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a sob. "You came," she whispered, as if the idea still felt impossible even while it was happening. Dean nodded slowly. "Of course I came," he said. Then he reached out and took her hand carefully, respectfully, as if touching her hand was touching the past. Her skin was cool and delicate, but her grip, when she managed to tighten it, was real. Eleanor swallowed, struggling to speak. I didn't think you would." Dean leaned slightly closer, his eyes holding hers. "I read every word," he said, "and I couldn't stay where I was, not after that." Her breathing hitched. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't do more." Dean's chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. For a second he saw himself at 8 years old again, standing in that hallway, wanting someone to tell him he wasn't worthless. Now the roles were reversed. Now the person who needed that message was the one who had once saved him. He squeezed her hand gently. "Miss Russo," he said, voice low and steady, "you need to hear me and I need you to believe me." He paused, letting the words settle. "You didn't fail me." Eleanor's eyes squeezed shut, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I did," she whispered, shaking her head weakly. I watched you hurt." Dean shook his head slowly. "You saved me," he said, and when he said it, he meant it with the full weight of truth, not the sweetness of sentiment. Eleanor's lips trembled. "I only brought you sandwiches." Dean's eyes glistened. "You brought me food," he said, "and you brought me dignity. You never made me feel like a charity case. You made excuses so I could pretend I wasn't being helped. You let me keep my pride when I didn't have much else." He swallowed, his throat burning. "When you're a kid and you're hungry all the time, you start to believe hunger is your identity. You start to believe it means you deserve less. But you made me feel like someone noticed." Eleanor stared at him, as if she had never allowed herself to imagine her small act could be seen this way. Dean leaned closer. "Those sandwiches weren't just lunch," he said softly. "They were proof that someone cared." Susan stood in the doorway, one hand covering her mouth, tears silently falling. Dean's voice softened further. "You wrote that you carried guilt for 46 years, he said. That you regretted not fighting harder, but Miss Russo, you gave me something most people never give a kid like I was." He paused. "You gave me a reason not to give up on myself." Eleanor's breathing became uneven, overwhelmed. Dean opened the folder Robert had brought and placed it gently on the bed, not shoving it toward her, not making it a spectacle, but offering it like a promise. "And I want to do something now," he said, "so that your heart can rest." Eleanor's eyes flickered down, confused. Dean looked at her directly again. "You wrote that kindness isn't enough," he said, "that you wanted systemic change." He nodded once. "You were right." Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly, trying to understand. Dean's voice steadied. "So I'm going to do what you couldn't," he said quietly. "Not because you failed, but because you inspired me." He tapped the folder gently. "Tonight, in your name, we're starting something that will feed children in Steubenville. Breakfast and lunch. No shame, no questions, just food." Eleanor's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening slightly. What are you saying?" Dean held her hand tighter. "I'm saying your kindness didn't end with a sandwich," he whispered. "It started something in me that lasted a lifetime, and now it's going to become something that lasts beyond both of us." Eleanor's tears fell freely now, but they looked different. Less like regret and more like release, as if a knot inside her was finally loosening. Dean leaned in close enough that only she could fully hear him. "You don't get to die believing you failed," he said softly. "Not when you were one of the only people who saw me before the world ever did." Eleanor's lips moved, but no words came. Dean stayed there, holding her hand, while the room became filled with the kind of silence that isn't empty but full. Full of decades, full of forgiveness, full of unspoken gratitude finally given a voice. And outside that small house in Steubenville, the cold night continued like any other night, unaware that inside, two lives had finally met again, and a quiet act from a third-grade classroom was about to turn into something no spotlight could ever fully capture. The promise that would not be quiet. Dean remained beside Eleanor's bed long after the first wave of emotion had passed, long after her breathing steadied and her tears slowed, long after the room settled into that hushed rhythm familiar to places where sickness and love coexist. He did not rush the moment. He had spent his life learning when to enter and when to exit, when to charm and when to vanish, but nothing in that training applied here. Here, there was only presence. He spoke to her softly about things that did not require strength to receive, about the old school building, about how strange it felt to be back in town, about how he still remembered the way the snow used to pile against the windows in winter until the classroom looked like it had been swallowed by white silence. Eleanor listened, sometimes with eyes closed, sometimes watching him as if trying to reconcile the voice with the boy she had once known. And when she tired, he stopped. When she drifted, he waited. There was no schedule. There was no performance. There was only the quiet exchange of two lives that had once touched briefly and now, improbably, were touching again at the end. Eventually, Susan suggested she rest. Dean stood slowly, carefully, reluctant to disturb the fragile peace of the room. Before he let go of Eleanor's hand, she tightened her grip with surprising insistence, her thin fingers wrapping around his with a strength that seemed to come not from muscle but from meaning. Her voice was weak but clear. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I chose to write. I chose to remember." Dean bent closer so she would not need to strain. "Maybe," he said gently. "But I choose to answer." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since he had arrived, her mouth curved into something that looked unmistakably like relief. When he stepped back into the hallway, Susan followed, closing the door partway so her mother could rest. Her face was wet, her eyes shining in the dim light. "She's been carrying that for so long," Susan said quietly. "The idea that she should have done more, that she failed." Dean nodded. "Teachers carry more than they're ever given credit for," he replied. Susan studied him for a moment, then said something that surprised him. "She never talked about you as a celebrity," she said. "She talked about you as the boy who used to stay inside during recess to help clean erasers because he was embarrassed about his shoes." The image landed with quiet force. Dean exhaled slowly. "That sounds about right," he said. They stood there for a moment, not as a star and a stranger, but as two people connected by the same woman in a small back bedroom. Later in the guest room Susan had insisted he use, Dean did not sleep immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed, coat folded beside him, letter resting on the nightstand. He could hear the muted sounds of the house, the hum of an appliance, the distant creak of pipes, the soft footsteps of Susan moving carefully so as not to wake her mother. It was not a rich house. It was not an impressive house. It was simply a house where a woman had spent her life trying to do right by children and now was nearing the end of it. Dean realized with a sudden, aching clarity that if he left Steubenville having only comforted Eleanor Russo, it would not be enough. Not because she needed more, but because what she had named in her letter, systems, hunger, quiet suffering, still existed. Her regret would not be answered by words alone. It would be answered by action. That thought did not feel like pressure. It felt like alignment, as if something he had always meant to do was finally revealing its shape. Morning came gray and cold, the sky low and heavy with October clouds. Dean woke early and sat by the small window, watching the neighborhood stir. A man scraped frost from a windshield. A woman bundled a child into a jacket. Somewhere a dog barked. Life continued, indifferent to celebrity and crisis alike. He dressed quietly and went to the kitchen, where Susan was already awake, nursing a cup of coffee with the distant focus of someone used to short nights. They spoke softly, and when she mentioned that Eleanor was sleeping, Dean nodded, grateful. He didn't want to overwhelm her. Not today. Today was not about emotion. Today was about structure. By mid-morning, Robert had arrived, his coat dusted with road salt, his briefcase once again in hand. They sat at the small dining table while Susan moved in and out, bringing coffee, then retreating to check on her mother. Dean unfolded a piece of paper and began to write, not notes, not speeches, but names, schools, district offices, community leaders. "I want to meet the superintendent," he said. "I want to meet whoever controls food programs in this town." Robert nodded, already making calculations. "We'll need to approach this carefully," he said. "School systems don't move fast. There are approvals, committees, budgets." Dean looked up. "Then we'll move them," he said, not sharply, not arrogantly, but with a calm that did not leave room for doubt. Robert had negotiated contracts that altered careers and reshaped studios. He recognized that tone. It meant the conversation was no longer about whether something would happen. It was about how. They drove first to the school district office, a squat brick building that carried none of the glamour of Dean's usual environments. When he walked in, there was no fanfare. A receptionist looked up, startled, unsure if she was mistaken. Within minutes, quiet whispers traveled down the hall. A superintendent emerged, then an assistant, then another administrator. Handshakes followed, awkward at first, then respectful. They were ushered into a modest conference room with a long table and mismatched chairs. Coffee appeared. Papers were set out. and Dean Martin sat among them not as an entertainer, but as a man who had lived what they discussed in reports. He did not begin with money. He began with memory. He spoke about sitting in classrooms unable to focus because his stomach hurt. He spoke about teachers who tried but did not have resources. He spoke about how hunger disguises itself as laziness, how exhaustion masquerades as stupidity. He spoke without drama, without accusation, but with precision, and as he spoke, the room changed. People leaned forward. Pens paused. The abstractions of student performance and attendance issues quietly transformed into a boy in worn shoes pressing his lips together so he wouldn't ask for what he knew his parents couldn't give. "I'm not here to donate and walk away," he said eventually. "I'm here to partner, to build something that stays." He placed his hands flat on the table. "Every child in this district who needs food will receive it, breakfast and lunch, not quietly, not as charity, as a right." There were questions, there were concerns. Logistics were raised, funding cycles, storage, staffing. Dean listened to everyone. Then he answered them with the one thing no bureaucracy resists forever: clarity backed by commitment. He would fund infrastructure. He would hire administrators. He would cover costs while systems adjusted. And he would not require children to prove they were poor enough to eat. "No means tests," he said. "No forms that turn hunger into a humiliation. If a child is in that building, they eat." The superintendent hesitated. "That's unconventional," he said carefully. Dean met his gaze. "So was bringing sandwiches from home," he replied. But it worked. By early afternoon, they had the beginnings of agreements, pilot programs, emergency funding, meetings scheduled with principals, a framework forming where before there had only been polite impossibility. When they stepped back outside, the cold felt sharper, but Dean felt lighter, not relieved, focused. As they walked toward the car, a woman from the office caught up with them. "My mother teaches second grade," she said quietly, as if embarrassed by the personal note. "She buys snacks with her own money." Dean stopped and looked at her. "She won't have to anymore," he said. The woman swallowed and nodded, eyes bright. Sometimes change begins not with applause, but with a single exhale. They spent the rest of the day moving, visiting Grant Elementary, walking its halls, standing in classrooms that smelled faintly of chalk and pencil shavings and something sweeter, paste, maybe, or young effort. Dean did not announce himself. He observed. He saw children leaning forward with interest. He saw others leaning back with absence. He saw teachers trying, as a leaner had once tried, within limits they had not created. When they entered the old third-grade wing, something inside him tightened. The floors looked smaller than memory had made them, the windows lower. Time had not shrunk the building. Adulthood had expanded him. He paused outside a classroom and placed a hand briefly against the wall, not in nostalgia, but in recognition. He was not here to revisit pain. He was here to interrupt its repetition. That evening he returned to Alina's house carrying not papers but purpose. He sat beside her bed again and spoke not of contracts but of children. He told her about walking through her old school, about seeing the classrooms, about the plans beginning to take shape. Alina listened with effort, her eyes sometimes drifting, then returning, as if she were fighting to remain present for something she had once thought impossible. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. Dean smiled gently. "I know," he said. "That's why I am." When he told her the foundation would carry her name, she shook her head faintly. "It's too much," she whispered. Dean leaned closer. "It's honest," he replied. "This started with you." A tear slid down the side of her face, but she was smiling, not the tentative smile of apology, the settled smile of peace. Later, alone again, Dean made a decision that would ripple far beyond Steubenville. He would not keep this quiet, not because he wanted praise, but because he understood the power of example. If his name could open doors, it could also open minds. He called his publicist and spoke carefully. No sensationalism, no tragedy framing. He wanted the story told not as celebrity charity, but as gratitude in motion. A teacher, a letter, a response, a community effort. "If this becomes about me," he said, "we've missed the point." The publicist hesitated. "The public will focus on you," she said honestly. Dean nodded. "Then I'll point them somewhere better." Within days, newspapers would carry headlines not about a new album or a show, but about a hometown initiative. Interviews would follow, other celebrities would call. But that was still ahead. That night in a quiet guest room, Dean sat again on the edge of the bed and realized something that surprised him. For the first time in many years, he did not feel as if he were building an image. He felt as if he were closing a circle. The boy who had once needed a sandwich had found the woman who had given it to him. And the man he had become was now positioned to give something back not only to her, but to every child still waiting for proof that they mattered. Outside, the neighborhood lights glowed softly. Inside, Alina Russo slept, her breathing shallow but steady. And in the space between them a promise had taken shape, one that would not be quiet, one that would not end with comfort alone, one that would soon stretch beyond one home, one town, one life. But tonight only Steubenville knew. And that was enough. The ripple that outlived them both. The story did not begin loudly. It did not break across the nation in the way scandals do, or in the way triumphs are packaged for consumption. It began quietly, the way most meaningful things do, with phone calls returned, meetings confirmed, contracts drafted not by publicity teams but by lawyers and school officials who suddenly found themselves part of something larger than procedure. In Steubenville, principals were summoned to district offices. Nutrition coordinators were called in. Storage rooms were measured. Cafeterias were inspected not for appearance but for capacity. And in those rooms where budgets were usually discussed with resignation, a different tone took hold. There was caution, of course. There were questions. But there was also something new, possibility. Not the fragile kind that flickers out under scrutiny, but the grounded kind that arrives when someone has already committed the resources and is only asking the system to meet him halfway. Dean moved through those first weeks without cameras, but not without purpose. He returned to California briefly to settle obligations, then came back again. He met with city officials and school boards not to dominate, but to insist gently and repeatedly that this program would not be symbolic. It would not be a photo opportunity. It would not be temporary. Food suppliers were contracted. Local workers were hired. Administrators were brought on not from Hollywood foundations, but from communities that understood what it meant to stretch a dollar and protect a child's dignity at the same time. When questions arose about sustainability, Dean answered them by expanding the endowment. When concerns were voiced about public reaction, he answered them by inviting transparency. When someone suggested starting small to test the waters, he shook his head. Hunger doesn't start small, he said. It starts daily. And so they built something daily in response. Only after the framework was secured did Dean agree to speak publicly. He did so not from a studio set, but from a modest auditorium in Steubenville, the kind of place where high school assemblies were held and community meetings argued out. He stood on a stage without dramatic lighting, without theatrical music, without the costume of performance. When he spoke, he did not recite statistics. He told a story. He spoke about a teacher who had written him a letter, about a classroom. About sandwiches, about shame, about the way hunger hides inside silence. He did not portray Alina Russ as a saint, but as what she truly was, a woman who had done what she could when the world gave her very little to work with. And then he said something that newspapers would later quote again and again. "We talk a lot about changing the future," he said, "but the future walks into classrooms every morning with empty stomachs and tired eyes. If we don't meet it there, we don't meet it at all." The response was not immediate in the way applause is immediate. It unfolded. Teachers wrote letters. Parents called school offices. Community groups offered to help. Other towns asked how they could replicate the model, and then something Dean had not orchestrated began to happen. Other public figures reached out, not to compete, not to attach themselves, but to ask genuinely how they could do something similar. He took their calls. He told them the truth. "It starts smaller than you think," he said. "And it lasts longer." Some would go on to establish their own hometown programs. Some would fund existing ones. Some would support Alina Russo's foundation directly. And the quiet work in Steubenville began to echo outward, not as a campaign, but as a pattern. Throughout it all, Dean returned often to Alina's bedside. As the weeks passed, her body grew weaker, but something in her spirit seemed to strengthen. She listened as Susan read her newspaper clippings about the program. She smiled when Dean described cafeterias being restocked, children lining up without fear, teachers no longer slipping food into drawers. "You've made trouble," she teased him once, her voice thin but amused. Dean smiled. "The good kind," he said. Sometimes she slept while he spoke, and he spoke anyway, believing that even if she did not consciously hear every word, some part of her understood. Other times she was alert, and when she was, she watched him with an expression that held neither pride nor regret, but something deeper, recognition. As if she were seeing not a star fulfilling a vow, but a child finally returning something he had been given long ago. On a cold morning in early November, Susan called him. Her voice was steady, practiced in a steadiness she had not chosen. Alina's breathing had changed. The nurse said it would not be long. Dean flew that afternoon. He did not bring press. He did not bring lawyers. He brought only himself. He sat beside Alina's bed and took her hand. She was mostly unconscious, but when he spoke her name, her eyes fluttered open. He leaned close. He did not tell her about budgets or numbers. He told her what she had wanted most to hear. "You didn't fail," he whispered. "You did exactly what mattered." Her fingers tightened once around his. It was not much, but it was enough. Elena Russo died later that night. Her funeral was small, attended by family, former colleagues, a handful of students now grown. Dean did not sit in the front row. He sat among them. He sent flowers with a note that did not mention foundations or fame. It read simply, "To the teacher who fed me when I was hungry and saw me when I was invisible." Susan wept when she read it, not because of the name attached, but because of the truth it held. In the days that followed, as condolences arrived and life pressed forward, something unexpected happened. Susan began receiving letters of her own. Former students wrote about her mother, about kindnesses never mentioned, about patience never praised, about moments that had mattered more than grades. Susan realized then that her mother had not just changed one life, she had quietly touched hundreds. Dean's foundation had not created that legacy, it had illuminated it. The Elena Russo Foundation began serving meals before winter settled fully over Ohio. Breakfast lines formed earlier than before, not because children were hungrier, but because now there was something waiting for them. Teachers noticed changes not in test scores first, but in faces. Children who had once arrived withdrawn began to speak more. Children who had struggled to sit still now finished assignments. Attendance improved. Energy shifted. The effects were subtle at first, then unmistakable. By spring, the district reported higher engagement across multiple schools. By the following year, graduation trajectories had changed. And woven through those statistics were stories no chart could capture. A boy who no longer hid in the bathroom at lunch. A girl who stopped falling asleep in class. A family that felt less alone. Scholarships followed, not the kind that demanded perfection, but the kind that recognized potential. Applications arrived from students who had never imagined writing one. Some had mediocre grades, some had difficult histories, all had desire. And that Dean insisted was enough to begin. He met some of them quietly, listening more than speaking, watching faces that carried the same mixture of fear and hope he once had. He did not tell them they would succeed. He told them they were allowed to try. Years passed. The foundation grew. Other programs emerged across the country, some inspired by the story, some simply strengthened by it. Federal initiatives eventually absorbed parts of the model, expanding school meal access nationwide. When that happened, reporters asked Dean if he felt his foundation had become obsolete. He shook his head. "If the work outgrows the name," he said, "that's success." And when the Elena Russo Foundation formally closed decades later, it did so not because hunger had vanished, but because what had once seemed radical had become recognized as necessary. In interviews toward the end of his life, Dean was often asked about accomplishments. His music, his films, his influence. He answered politely, then he redirected. He spoke about a classroom in Steubenville, about a teacher who had believed she hadn't done enough, about a letter that had arrived too late and yet somehow right on time. "Fame is loud," he said once, "but kindness is what echoes." He did not speak of Elena as a chapter. He spoke of her as a foundation, not the legal one. The human one. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, years later, his obituaries were long and deserved. They listed achievements. They named collaborators. They traced a career. But in Steubenville, the paper ran a different headline. It spoke of a hometown boy who had fed a town, of a teacher who had been honored, of a promise kept. Susan Russo was interviewed again. She spoke not of celebrity, but of a night when a man had knocked on her door and told her mother she had not failed. "He gave her peace," Susan said. "Everything else grew from that." At Grant Elementary, the cafeteria was eventually renamed. Children passed under a plaque bearing a simple sentence. Not about money, not about stars, about sandwiches and dignity, about hope. Teachers told the story not as legend, but as reminder, that what they did mattered, that what they saw mattered, that what they chose to do with what they saw could ripple farther than they would ever know. And that is where this story truly lives. Not in headlines, not in foundations, but in classrooms where children eat without fear, in teachers who understand they are not small, in communities that remember that change does not always arrive with noise, but sometimes with a woman placing a sandwich on a desk and a boy who grows up to place a world back in her hands. A teacher sent a letter full of regret. A student received it and refused to let it end there. And the ripple did what ripples always do. It outlived them both.